So now how do we make sure this person gets back in here? Do you know who Namita Patel is?
I don't, but we can see if she tries to log back in, hopefully, and if not, we can reach out to her.
It's probably going to be impossible to find one person.
I can look it up. I can look it up.
Oh, nope, that's not the right one. Jeez, there's a lot of names on this list. I think I found it. Yep.
Yeah. Is it a vcu.edu?
What was that?
Is it vcu.edu?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, sent the link. Now we wait, I guess.
The suspense is killing me.
All right. It's crazy. It would be fun if it's just me and you. I'll just present to you.
I'm game.
Yeah. It's a cool paper.
It is a very cool paper. It is indeed.
Two people just showed up. Danielle Reynolds and Carly Carlin. Here we go.
We'll give everyone a few minutes to kind of trickle in.
Deanna's here. On her way.
Hey, y'all.
Hey.
Hi, Diana. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Ready for this journal club?
Yes.
Yes, I'm excited.
So we have some of our members coming in. We'll let everyone, get settled. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
So we might have an extra person coming to the meeting. Her name is Dr. Petzinger. I actually interviewed with her yesterday with the University of Southern California, and she's very much involved in inclusivity and diversity within her own program. And she's written quite a few papers on this. So I sent her the link for this journal.
Awesome.
So you might be popping in at some point.
Nice.
Great, we look forward to having her.
It's exciting.
So we'll give everyone just a couple more minutes to come in. I know, people could be coming off from work or something, from the hospital. Hopefully everyone's keeping safe.
Trying to.
I mean, I know it's been crazy these past, I don't even know, month or so.
Yeah, numbers here in Austin. We just, I'm on my diagnostic medicine rotation. We just went over COVID numbers here in Austin and not looking good. Unfortunately, we did get the vaccine yesterday.
Wow.
It arrived yesterday. And so I think we got around 3,000 doses for the healthcare, frontline healthcare workers. And so that's exciting. They're scheduling people. They started scheduling them right away. But the community numbers aren't going to go down based on
No.
healthcare workers getting the vaccines. So we're, it's a whole nother land over here in Texas right now. And I know New York, y'all were doing really good for a while, but I think outside of New York City, your numbers are going up if I'm not wrong, right?
Some of the boroughs outside of Manhattan, the numbers are starting to go up again, like especially Staten Island.
Yeah, for sure.
It's slowly getting worse. I think it's because of the holidays and things like that.
Absolutely.
I just really hope there isn't another shutdown because a lot of these businesses are already going out, because of this.
Yeah, the businesses in the city right now, there's a lot of debate, let's call it. People are very frustrated with the new and ever-changing, restrictions.
Especially with the stimulus package, it's kind of been in limbo.
Yeah.
A lot of businesses are suffering. So, hopefully.
And I think kind of like making people lose trust in the healthcare system, which is, I think, causing a lot of people to probably not get the vaccine anytime soon. So it's
absolutely
that, like healthcare workers, like I think we're all on board to get it, but just like the layperson is kind of like, well, I don't really trust our healthcare system and I want to wait a few months, but it's kind of like everyone has to be on board in order for it to really
for it to actually do it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done in our communities to kind of garner trust. But I think we'll hopefully get there little by little. But I think at this point we can probably go ahead and get started. What do you think, Ali?
That's fine with me. You guys all good with that?
All right. So I'm going to give you a little brief introduction. So hopefully by now you know me, but if you don't by now, my name is Roxana. I am co-director of NeuroEquity with Diana, who is on this call, our lovely co-director here. And so this is our first ever virtual journal club. And we have a very exciting paper today. It's talking about the influence of demographics on the detection of Alzheimer's disease. And so we have Galadu Suba, who is an MD PhD candidate at New York Medical College. He's in his 5th year, planning to defend at the end of this academic year. Woot woot. And then he'll be returning to the hospital. Galadu is in Dr. Patrick Stanton's lab, who looks at learning and memory, and Galadu's thesis is looking at migraine work and long-term depolarization. Tell me if I'm saying this incorrectly. Spreading depolarization in the effects of migraine. And so without further ado, Galadu.
Thank you, Roxana. I didn't know you knew that much about me, actually. So
I mean,
so I'm going to start. Here is a share screen. Okay, share. Bear with me here. This is actually my first ever Zoom presentation, so please bear with me as I go through this. But our presentation today is the work of it's the work of a group at Mass Gen, but we were kind of focused on this because I was directed to it, I guess I should say, but because of Dr. Jonathan Jackson. 1 second, I'm just gonna make Roxanne my host. And okay, so Dr. Jackson is the head of the CARE research facility at Mass Gen, and they're in charge of looking at diversity and inclusion and improving it in neurological care. This work specifically was dealing with their Alzheimer's work, looking at subjective cognitive concerns, which are these subjective, obviously, self-reported concerns of memory loss, cognitive functioning, has been shown to be somewhat indicative of Alzheimer's dementia progression. And so they're looking at the influence of demographic factors on these subjective cognitive concerns. And so just begin with a little outline. We have the introduction here. We're gonna have an introduction, including the hypothesis, obviously. We'll have methods, results, and conclusions. Kind of straightforward, but obviously things go as they go. And so just to get started, we're gonna talk about Alzheimer's disease, what it is, who gets it, things like that. And then we'll get more into the subjective cognitive concerns, what they are, and the relationship of the meaningfulness of SCCs with demographic factors. And so what is Alzheimer's disease? It's an irreversible progressive disorder of dementia. It's the most common cause of dementia. I believe it's 65% of all dementia cases are Alzheimer's. And it's the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. It's actually the 5th in the elderly population above 65. And who gets it? Obviously, it's mostly older people, but I do believe I think it was 200,000 people, I think it was in the year 2018, under the age of 65 were diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So it's not only that population, but we still need to be aware of everybody. And as far as demographics, 2 in 3 people with AD are women, and African and Hispanic Americans are 1.5 times and 2.5 times more likely to develop AD than Caucasian Americans, respectively, obviously. And so what is the pathology for AD? And so in 1906, Dr. Alois Alzheimer found these plaques, quote unquote. I don't think he necessarily called them exactly plaques and tangles, but he found these plaques and tangles, which are pretty much pathognomonic for Alzheimer's at this point, in the brain of a woman who had died from an unusual mental disorder. These plaques and tangles are found to be extracellular deposits of amyloid beta plaques and intracellular hyperphosphorylated tau tangles. This is a microtubule associated protein. And the aggregation of these, both extracellularly and intracellularly, leads to the atrophy, or leads to cell death and atrophy of neural tissue. So this is kind of the classic picture you see probably in first, second year med school, looking at Alzheimer's disease. You've seen something like this likely. And it is known that the pathology for Alzheimer's, so the beta plaques and the hyperphosphorylated tau tangles, precedes dementia, the onset of dementia, symptomatically by many years. And so the idea is that if we can maybe identify it earlier, because there really isn't a treatment. So like I mentioned earlier, it's irreversible. So we don't really have a full treatment yet that can cure this disorder. So what we do is cognitive enrichment, and that is thought to prolong the lifespan following diagnosis. The average diagnosis time, or average time to death following diagnosis now is about 4 to 8 years, but that's been shown to go up to about 20 years in some patients. In terms of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, it's mostly made on personal medical history and neuropsychological testing, leading to possible or probable diagnoses. And this diagnosis is mainly based on exclusion of other pathologies, Niemann Pick's, other dementias, vascular dementia, and so forth. But the definitive diagnosis, at least coming into this paper, my idea, or what I understood as a definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's, is based on postmortem histological analysis. And this is part of the reason I chose this paper, because it actually uses PET scanning to identify amyloid. And so I'll get into that a little bit as we get into the measures, but I thought that was kind of cool, just directing me here. The idea is that if we can identify early manifestations of Alzheimer's, maybe we can have an early diagnosis and therapeutic interventions at an earlier time point. And so I mentioned subjective cognitive concerns. These are self-reported deterioration in cognitive performance, not detected through standard neuropsychological tests. And classic example here would be you notice you've lost your keys 10 times this month when you literally never lost your keys once last year. So that would be some kind of subjective cognitive concern that would probably not get picked up by a standard test. But at that level, maybe as a physician, somebody comes to you with that, what are you supposed to do with that? So there have been several epidemiological studies that have associated the risk, that have associated an increased risk of progression to Alzheimer's dementia with increased SCCs in individuals. Additionally, there's evidence showing that higher prevalence of positive biomarkers for amyloidosis and neurodegeneration also associate with increased SCCs. However, as these are subjective cognitive concerns, this is not a specific measure of Alzheimer's, obviously. This isn't something that we can just say somebody has high SCCs, they have Alzheimer's. So the way that I looked at this paper, I'm not sure this is exactly their thinking, but I was thinking is, we have this subjective cognitive concern measure, and we know it's not the best, it's not specific, but we know that it does have some value. How can we improve that value? And one way that you might do that is by looking at specific populations in which SCCs are involved. And this is obviously right along the lines of NeuroEquity, and what we're trying to do is to know our populations and know our patients and know where we can use different things and know where we can actually help people that we have in front of us. And the idea being here is that you have population X and population Y. You have subjective cognitive concerns, essentially the same level in both populations. And if we were to put these subjective cognitive concerns on either side, on the right side of this balance here, it should raise this man, or whatever you want to call population X, or this woman, or whatever you want to call population Y, from above this level, arbitrary level, obviously, of clinical AD diagnosis. Bear with me, this is very rudimentary Photoshop, or whatever you might call it. So we put these subjective cognitive concerns on the scale, and it raises it. What we see here is that it raises the diagnosis to clinical AD in one population, but doesn't in another. And this would be due to a number of unidentified population factors. We'll get into a little bit more of what that might be. And that's pretty much what this paper is what are these unidentified factors that may alter the ability of SCCs to show us that this person is possibly or probably has Alzheimer's. So what is in the literature already? So as I mentioned earlier, there's a 2 to 1 ratio of males to females in AD, but the risk of whether SCC confers greater risk in men versus women is not known as of now. There's been data on both sides, essentially. As far as age, and this is kind of makes sense in that you have SCCs increase with age. So the older people get, you have more cognitive deterioration, and this is just natural aging, and so you're going to have increased SCCs. And what longitudinal studies have shown is that SCCs may be more predictive for dementia in a lower population, or for dementia and amyloid beta. And the way that you kind of would explain this is that as you increase SCCs with age, you have a bigger bucket where any further increase in SCCs would be noticeable. So increasing SCCs in a younger population where that has less SCCs is like dropping a cup into a bucket, whereas into an older population that has way more SCCs, it's like dropping a cup into the ocean. So you're not going to notice that effect. And that's kind of the same idea that goes along here in education, where those with less education have been shown to have a greater number of SCCs. I don't know if I have an exact definition or explanation for why that is, or if I could find one, but that's just what the data has shown so far. And that kind of goes along again, where you have the longitudinal study showing that those with higher education, so the smaller bucket, less SCCs, provide a more prognostic value for SCCs being prognostic for AD. Sorry, it's a little confusing there. And so given this information, the group hypothesized that age and years of education would modify the relationship. Thereby, a younger age, greater years of education would be associated with a stronger relationship between SCC and amyloid beta burden. This is, again, my kind of visual schema, whatever you might call it, of that showing. So if somebody with higher education might actually having the same amount of SCCs might show AD, would be AD diagnostic, whereas in the lower education population, that might not be diagnostic. And that's what their hypothesis is. And same thing with the younger old versus the older old. This is a very strange term, but they're defining it as 70 to 80, let's say less than 80 is younger old, greater than 80 is older old. So in the younger old, SCCs might be indicative of amyloid or of AD diagnosis, whereas in the older old, it might not be. And again, this is kind of the idea of drop in a bucket versus drop in the ocean. And so that's the introduction and hypothesis. And I think Roxana's monitoring the chat if anybody has any questions or anything like that. Also, just feel free to chime in at any time, any questions. So for our methods, we're going to look at the experimental design of what they were trying to do, the population that they performed these experiments in, the measures that they observed, and the analysis that they did. So this is essentially the experimental design. We have a population. So in the sex example, we have male versus female, and we see that SCCs essentially, we don't know what it's going to do. So are there unidentified populations in either males or females that might cause this to not rise? That's what we're looking at. And then, of course, we're also looking at age and education. So younger old versus older old, as well as higher education versus lower education. And the population that this study was conducted in was 252 participants in the Harvard Aging Brain Study. So this is an AD study that's at Harvard, just prospective data. And they chose clinically normal patients based on these criteria here. And the idea being that SCCs are supposed to be predictive of Alzheimer's. So we want people that are clinically normal presenting, wherein we know that they might have the amyloid beta pathology, but that's not presenting symptomatically yet. And so they're clinically normal. And then in this population, would SCCs have a predictive value? That's what we're looking at. And then is that effect modulated by these demographic measures, so age, sex, and education. Something that I did want to highlight here, and this is kind of, again, specific to what we're doing in terms of NeuroEquity, is that these tests it's something in designing your experiment, you have to kind of consider, were these tests validated on the populations that I'm trying to use? So in the population we're using here, we're trying to use a diverse in terms of age, and diverse in terms of sex, diverse in terms of education. So were these original tests validated? So what I did is I looked back on all of them. These have been validated. There was one that I couldn't find validation for in the next slide. But that's kind of something that we wanted to highlight here, is that what are the measures that we're using to perform our experiment, to perform our research? We need to know that they are actually usable in our population. Because when I'm looking into this, I see clinical dementia rating was validated in 2007 in an Asian population. So essentially, if I were to have gotten data on clinical dementia rating anytime before that point, I couldn't necessarily be sure that it applies to the Asian population that I have in wherever I'm working. So it's kind of, we want to make sure that we're aware of what we're using and how those tools are actually propagating the inequities that we see in our society, the health inequities that we see in our society, because now that would direct me as a physician to treat a certain patient differently. And we want to be sure of that. And then the same thing, that would direct me as a researcher to use different measures so that I can actually accurately represent my population. In addition to the demographic values here, they also looked at socioeconomic status and occupation status and things like that, and see if that also affected the relationship between SCCs and amyloid beta burden. So speaking of SCCs, they use these three measures here: the early memory subscale, the early everyday cognition scale, general frequency of the memory functioning questionnaire, and adaptation. As I think I mentioned, or adaptation of the structural and telephone interview for dementia assessment. The everyday memory subscale of the everyday cognition scale, that was the one that I couldn't find an exact something that said this scale has been validated in a diverse population with X percentage of blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know for sure, but again, this is also like my 30 minutes of looking on the internet. I'm sure the people that were presenting this paper or anybody that's using this should be looking into making sure of those kind of things. And then secondarily, their second measure was amyloid burden measured by PET scanning. So I thought this was really cool, kind of looking at this idea where normally Alzheimer's has been diagnosed via postmortem histological analysis. And that's pretty much the only way that it has been for a long time, since 1906. But using radioactive tracers for amyloid, it's been shown that you can visualize beta amyloid. And essentially what you would be seeing is you get this radioactive tracer. So there are three that are in use. This paper used the Pittsburgh compound B. This tracer you allow to cross the blood-brain barrier, give it time, and you do the PET scanning, and you're essentially going to see increased fluorescence in a increased beta amyloid brain scan. So positive scan here, negative scan here. And so what we're doing is seeing how the subjective cognitive concerns are related to amyloid beta burden. And then secondarily, how that relationship is modified by the demographic factors that we're looking at. And so the analysis was a separate linear regression models using amyloid beta burden, education, age and sex as predictors of SCC, and then secondarily seeing how education, age and sex modify the relationship of amyloid beta and SCC. And then they also that's exactly right, assess modification association between SCC and amyloid beta burden by age, sex, and education. And so that's our methods. Do we have any questions yet? Anything? I can't see you guys. I can only see my screen. So
Not yet, no.
All right. And so with the results, I'm just going to give through the sample population that we had and modifications by the demographic factors that we're looking at. And so our sample population was 73 years old, 57% female, not exactly that 2-to-1 ratio that we spoke about earlier, but still this was representative of just the population they had. And then the 15.8 years of education, I think when I was reading this, I thought that was kind of high because that kind of implies some level of like maybe more than a couple of years of college. But they did mention that this was one of their best variables in terms of normalizing to the whole population. And additionally, they also, looking at SES, they said they had a higher SES, but they believe that because the education was normalized, that kind of equalizes everything out. And then finally, I thought this was interesting in that their 26% of their population was positive for beta amyloid via the PET scanning. And this is also the exact same number that I think another paper previously showed using the same method. But I think it kind of just highlights that point of Alzheimer's pathology begins way before Alzheimer's presentation. And the idea that these were all clinically normal patients, right? So all the 252 people that were in this study, they were all walking around as clinically normal people, but 26% of them were positive for beta amyloid, indicating that 26% of them might, within the next couple of years, develop Alzheimer's disease. And so what our results are, it pretty much only came down to education. So with the sex and the age, there were no independent effects of those two variables to affect the relationship between SCC and amyloid beta burden. However, with education, as you can see here in the high education group, as SCC composite score increases, you actually have a significant increase in amyloid beta burden. So that allows you to use SCC as a predictor of amyloid beta burden in this high population. However, in the low education population, we don't see such a relationship. And this kind of gets back to the idea of that drop in the bucket thing. So it's, if you have a cup in a bucket versus a cup in an ocean, this where you have more SCCs in the lower education group. So any changes in SCC don't have as much of a significant effect on the amyloid beta burden. At least that's not detectable. But that is detectable in the higher education group. And then secondarily, they also looked at this mediation model, they called it, where they were able to show direct effects, obviously amyloid beta burden, SCC composite score, but they were also showing this indirect effect where an education was having an effect indirectly by amyloid beta burden. So it's kind of getting back at that idea of education, level of education does affect the relationship between amyloid beta burden and SCC composite score. This is a little complicated for me. So if anybody has any questions here, again, I will gladly take some. Yeah, and finally, we'll get into the conclusions of this paper, which pretty much come down to the last bullet on here, which is that individuals who report concerns of memory changes, so as subjective cognitive concerns, may compromise an otherwise normal memory examination, so clinically normal, should be assessed within the context of the education level. So if they are high educated and they're presenting these subjective cognitive concerns, perhaps you now direct them toward more enrichment or toward more exclusionary diagnostic methods. Whereas somebody in the lower education method might just be just the standard protocol that you would normally use. I think that's all. And then, so just some take-home points for you guys. Kind of the idea that I wanted to get at was that in selecting your neuropsychiatric measures for whatever, either in terms of designing an experiment or in terms of interpreting data from whatever paper you're reading or anywhere you're getting it from, are these measures validated in diverse and representative populations? And more than that, and as I was looking at all these, it seems that these things have to be continuously reassessed because populations continuously changing. So we have to kind of move along. So it's as we develop these new measures or as we look at our old measures again, we have to constantly make sure that they're applicable to our populations wherever we are. And then finally, in the experimental design, we also need to make sure that our experimental design takes efforts to assess the diverse and representative population. So if we have a population that is 90% Caucasian, maybe perhaps we might need a measure that is, or whatever experiments that we're doing, we might want to make sure that we necessarily include, very much so include that population. That's probably unlikely at this point, but because those data are already out there, likely. And I think that's all I have. So yeah, thank you guys for coming. This is just supposed to be a quick presentation. Any questions, just for any kind of discussion that we can have, would be really welcomed.
I am so impressed. I want to say thank you so much for the wonderful presentation that you just gave. It was very in-depth, and there was a lot of thought you can see that was put behind what you just presented. So thank you for that. I do have some questions.
Of course.
So I read this when Roxana first sent it out a while ago before we had this scheduled.
Mhm.
And I don't remember when on my read seeing the racial demographics of their population, racial ethnic demographics of their population that they used. And then if it was a specific database that they were using either. So I don't know if you could shed some light on that.
So this is like probably the one aspect. Like I wanted to present two papers for this, honestly, because they did two papers in the same year, kind of on this idea. And I think they separated it because those are just separate. I think like they looked at the race aspect in a separate paper. So that was, by the way, thanks for the question, because that was just so. Because remember, I think I mentioned that at the beginning, where the African Americans and Hispanics are 1.5 and 2 times more likely than Caucasians to develop to develop Alzheimer's. So it's like when I see that, it's like, how do we design a paper and not include race? But then I look further down, you see, okay, so they were looking at race maybe separately, and what they did see when they did try to look at race was that subjective cognitive concerns are associated with objective memory performance. So this isn't Alzheimer's disease per se in Caucasians, but it's not associated with the objective memory performance in African Americans. So so if you look at the African Americans, the same kind of thing as the low education, where you have there's not really a significant correlation between memory performance and subjective cognitive concerns. Whereas with Caucasians, we do have this. And this kind of gets back to the idea of, was this subjective cognitive concern measure, whatever measure they use, is it more ideal for one population than the other, right? And in this case, in terms of memory performance, it's showing that it is more ideal, it is more significant for Caucasian, and it's not necessarily applicable for African Americans. And that kind of leads me to the next step of, how does this affect the use of SECs in terms of Alzheimer's diagnosis? And I think that would be an interesting question. If I get a chance to talk to Dr. Jackson, I would make sure to ask that. But I do think that's a very interesting question that we do have to kind of pay attention to, because if we're going to be using these SECs more in terms of trying to diagnose patients, we have to know which patients it helps out with. And and this kind of almost makes you question that. Thanks for the question.
Oh yeah, thank you for answering. And I think there was also a bullet point on one of your slides that hit on a little bit, maybe genetic risk factors or other risk factors.
So they didn't.
I'm sorry.
They didn't per se get into risk factors. I don't think I got into that here. Things like ApoE4, that's usually like what people would look at. There's other papers that have looked at SCCs and ApoE4, and there is some correlation there as well. But they didn't get into the genetic risk factors. Your point actually brought me back to something that Roxana highlighted to me, in that, like, in GWAS studies, I think it's like 80% of the samples are Caucasians, right? So it's, if you're interpreting GWAS data, is that applicable to your population? It's just kind of getting back to that same idea of just making sure what the data means. It means what it means for that population that it was conducted on. It might not necessarily mean the same for your population. It may be a sample, not a population. Maybe that's a better way to say it, statistically.
Yeah, I've recently been looking at a little bit. So I could have swore I saw something about risk factor and my brain went there, but I was also eating dinner too. So it might have just, I might have missed something. But I was recently looking at like genetic risk factors or markers, biomarkers. I think that's the term that might have been used on one of your slides. And thinking about do these. So I know there's a lot of with personalized healthcare and thinking about these biomarkers and how we can target diseases more specifically to individuals using this knowledge. But then there's also, right, there's these other inherent problems that are causing these disparities. So is the reason that African Americans are twice as likely to have Alzheimer's in the future? Is that a genetic factor? Is that, thinking about these things, or is it this some other, social determinant of health? And so I think that could be, so thinking about like, where can NeuroEquity, where can we as, students and future neurologists go with this and use this, this paper as a brainstorming session.
There was something that I saw that I feel like, I don't know if this is the exact appropriate point to bring this into NeuroEquity, but so the PET scanning that I talked about that's being used for amyloid beta testing.
That was super interesting.
The coolest thing. I'm like, this is awesome. Alzheimer's is like, that's a new stage in Alzheimer's. But then as I'm further looking into that, it's not covered by Medicare. And it's like, so people that actually need that can't get it, right? Like, and if it's not covered by Medicare, that's going to make it a financial discrepancy, right? Now we're going to have maybe more people that are diagnosed in a higher socioeconomic status, but that means we're missing people that we're not even looking at them. We don't even know they have it. And like that in terms of NeuroEquity, I feel like is massive. Like that has to be addressed. Yeah,
that's huge. And I was so excited when you brought up the PET scanning, because this is something I haven't touched on in a while, is Alzheimer's disease and diagnosis. Because in med school, our first 2 years we learn it's it's postmortem diagnosis and it's clinical before that. And then to hear about this PET scanning technology, but then again, to hear that it's not covered by Medicaid. And so how does our health policy play into these disparities? Because you think the earlier you can treat, the longer you can slow progression. And if you don't have private insurance,
you might have to do 7 more tests to compensate for the same amount of thing that you would get from one amyloid beta scan. And it's like, that's frustrating.
Yeah. So that would be something really cool to look into for the future. And then thinking too, like what databases, so going back to the first question, if you talk to this researcher again, what databases were they using? And is there information there that we could look at again in another way?
I'm sure. So they use the Harvard brain aging. So it's an Alzheimer's just specifically for this. So it's directed at trying to find cures for Alzheimer's or early diagnosis and whatever you can do to improve Alzheimer's care. And so they have, I don't remember what the total number of patients is in the database, but they ended up taking out 252 that were clinically normal. And I believe this database is used pretty heavily in Alzheimer's research. I've definitely seen it in multiple things, but I don't know how easy it is accessible. And they are at Harvard, so I'm sure they have easier access than I would, or than we would somewhere else. But then, and also on the database, on the database aspect. So I mentioned where they have higher socioeconomic status. The population is going to be self-selected, right? Because you have people that are going to volunteer to be a part of this. That's again another part of how do we address equity if people aren't included, right? But it's that database. They didn't mention race in terms of what I saw here, but it was that, like I mentioned, the higher education is like almost 16 years of education. It's kind of a lot. I mean, Boston is a pretty highly educated place, so I don't want to say it makes sense, but it does. But that then is another aspect, that is the high education versus low education here different than high education versus low education generally? Because they said it was normalized, but that just means the middle is the middle and there's equal on both sides. But that doesn't mean it's not here or here. It's that can still be changed. So that probably would be another thing I would ask Dr. Jackson in terms of what this data means.
That's a good point to bring up, that 15.6 years. I was like, that's pretty up there. That's a bachelor's
everybody
degree.
graduated college, 12 years of
Yeah.
school, and then everybody graduated undergrad, like, or at least got 3 years. Like that's
Yeah.
That's a really good point to bring up. Sometimes you got to read between the numbers there.
I think they try to balance it by saying that SES was normalized, so it's not it, but it's like it's where you live, it's where you are, so it's gonna be normalized where you are probably.
Exactly. I mean, I think for sure, like in the New York City area, that's definitely a really huge amount of years to be in school.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, the patient population, at least that I saw in the Bronx, it was like usually like elementary school going into high school. They usually stop going to school, so they would be a part of that lower end of
For sure.
of the curve. So I feel like I wish that there was a way for them to kind of like normalize it a bit more accurately, because I feel like for sure in their area they probably did, but I think for the general population, especially those cities where it's very densely populated and there's a lot of people of lower socioeconomic status, I don't think we can really apply that information to that population. So I think it's a good start.
Yeah, Boston isn't exactly known to be the most diverse part of the country, so there's definitely more to be done here. I think it's a very cool paper. It's a very cool way they did it. They're looking at things that need to be looked at, but there definitely is more that needs to be done.
Something that I actually mentioned to Gally not too long ago is that, I recently went to a grand rounds where the speaker did a phenomenal job, and she was talking about how race corrections for GFR, spirometry, pulmonary function tests really do a disservice to those races that they're using these corrections for. And so kind of in my mind, I'm trying to reconcile, okay, when is it appropriate, or how do we find the balance of appropriately validating some of these diagnostic tools to our specific populations, and when does it actually disfavor them and disfavor their clinical outcomes? And I think it's not as black and white when it comes to neurology, because there's a lot of different things that influence, especially in Alzheimer's, because it's not just purely neurological, but there's some like psychiatry involved in there as well and whatnot. And I feel like those are very heavily influenced by our social cultural factors. And so I don't know if the group has any thoughts on this, but for me, I'm like, okay, like how do we as clinicians interpret this data, and as scientists, how do we go about making sure that we're doing this in a accurate and precise way?
For sure. Yeah. I mean,
I was going to say, just starting, I think it's including the populations that we want to that we're treating, just including the populations that we're treating. And I think I read a statistic in the 2020 Alzheimer's disease, like facts and figures PDF that's out there.
I saw that.
I think in 2040, the majority of Alzheimer's patients are going to be Black and brown.
Yeah.
So it's like all of these studies are not including them. So I think the first step, Roxana, to your point, is we gotta include the patients that we're treating and going to treat. And I think it's also getting away from this biological difference between different ethnicities and different races, and more leaning towards, like, if we have biomarkers, if we have this data, then we can use that, but it's more personalized to the person, the individual, and moving more towards, we know it's the social determinants of health. There's so many factors that go into that giant bucket, using that term. But I think there's those two things are what we can do, is study the groups and include them in our research. But then also we need to kind of move away from this biological difference between ethnicities, and I think that's really is harming us.
It is. It is. I feel like that's what they maybe were trying to do. You know, it's like we're just trying to understand it better. And I think that's something I was looking at in the idea of like, so if when you're validating these studies, you're not trying. I think when you do that, the hope is that you end up with the same, right? You're hoping that you do the clinical dementia rating scale, and that you do it with the 90% African American population, and you're getting the same results that you would have been getting with any other population that when it was made in 1980 or whenever it was, right? And that's the idea, is that we've had a history where things didn't include. So now we can't act on the history, or we can't act on data from those time points. We have to make sure they work now, and that just means that we have to work. It's kind of like extra work for our generation, or for whatever generation's taking this work up, because we're not just doing the work to go forward, we're doing the work to catch up, right? We're doing the work that is improving Alzheimer's. We're also doing the work to include people in Alzheimer's research.
Yeah, I agree. And to kind of both of your points, Diana and Galadou, I think that absolutely we have to go away from kind of like lumping these large groups of people, of individuals who very well may not belong in that grouping, right? Like African American or Black. How do you know how are you including people who are maybe also, or Hispanic, I think is a great example. Like you have Hispanic as this big grouping, but you have people from mainland Spain, you have people from Ecuador, Mexico, Chile, Argentina. Like these are all very diverse individuals. And so to kind of lump them as Hispanic and say, okay, well, this is a homogenous group, it's actually very heterogeneous. And so going to more like ancestral, biological, like connecting the biological components to the ancestral lineage and genetic makeup versus, okay, this social group of Spanish speaking people, or this social group of more dark skinned people, or even like lighter skinned people. I feel like even in the white, race, there's, you have Eastern European, Western European, Middle Eastern, like all these different groups. And so yeah, I think that's a very fair point.
I think it's
I think that's
we were talking about this earlier in terms of definitions, right? Like we made, it's kind of the same idea. We're using these definitions of white, Black, whatever you want to call it, from that were defined. I don't know when these terms were defined. I just know I was born in the world where these were the terms, and that's what we've been using since I was born, right? And it's like we have to somehow get those very obviously limiting definitions out of our vocabulary in the way that we're using them, in the way that we're implementing them, right?
Yeah, I think so. Thinking about those definitions and how are people identified? So, are people marking down? Are they self-identifying, or are they, is the doctor, the MA in the office marking down what race they think they are? And so that's one piece. And I really like what Roxana was talking about with the ancestral genomics, and thinking about how do we use that data, especially with like, the rise of 23andMe and Ancestry. And I know, so this summer, I did some research around ancestral genomics in non-small cell lung cancer, disparities that exist there, because we know with non-small cell lung cancer, African Americans have worse outcomes by far. And so thinking, okay, if we use ancestral genomics, if we can find biomarkers, does that change, individuals with these biomarkers, that change outcomes? And the answer for that study, we were hoping, yes, right? Because then you can target this. And I was working with a pharmaceutical company, so it's like, okay, we can target this. But the answer was no. As long as people had equal access, and that was in this case, as long as people had equal access to that testing, and then in return the cancer immunotherapies, they had equal outcomes. So then you think, okay, this is going back to some other factors there, but that ancestral genomics stuff is, I think, going to be the advent of kind of a new way to look at individuals' care.
I'll admit, I haven't looked much into ancestral genomics, but that does sound fascinating, and I definitely will. We were kind of, sorry, where was I going? I lost my thought. Sorry.
Happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, same.
Maybe I have subjective cognitive concerns.
Yes, exactly. I'm reporting right now. And we're all pretty highly educated, so this is significant.
I love
Too
it.
many years. we would
Yeah,
skew the we would skew
that's childish for
the
15
data.
at this point. Jesus, I didn't think about that.
I feel like the amount of years for MDs is really just infinite because you're a lifelong learner. You take your boards every 10 years, you're just forever a student.
That's true.
But then the MD PhDs, y'all, I don't know what you're doing. I'm so glad I'm done. I'm so glad I'm almost at the end. I'm praying for y'all.
No, honestly, much needed, very much needed.
Especially right now. This is the time where I need it because I need to get through this to get back into the hospital and actually finish that school.
You guys are almost there.
I just finished and I was like, I don't know how I would have been able to put myself through any more of this.
I don't know how I have. Last night I was in the lab and I was just like, I think I'm done. I think I need to just go home because I'm over it. But
yeah,
I'll be back again tomorrow, I'm sure. Yeah.
but I do think the whole idea of ancestral genomics is really interesting because just in so many cultures and so many different demographics, you're going to see just a mix of so many different things. So in order for us to kind of like narrow that down and kind of zone in on where we're actually seeing that increased incidence of that beta amyloid, I think it would be like monumental to actually be able to make those connections.
And they actually be validated by real
objective data.
Yeah, not just some guy in a room made up and said this is white, like that would be
because like, on paper, I'm technically Caucasian, but I'm Middle Eastern. There's no European in me at all. So I think it would be really, really interesting. But then like, if someone who is collecting this data, like maybe a medical student or maybe a nurse practitioner or whoever, they could easily miscategorize somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally could see how this data could be skewed.
Yeah.
And I think objectifying the data would definitely give us a lot of insight.
Yeah, that was one of the things because I remember in the presentation I used the like person blocking the scale, and it's like I called her unidentified population factors, and the idea with the paper is that they're looking at these three, right? They're looking at education, age, and sex. But like we're all very aware that those are not the only factors within any population, right? There may be cultural differences that maybe, or there's willingness to go to the position, or maybe there's proximity to a position, right? Like all of these things matter. And so maybe that's what actually is directing your ability to get these concerns actually dealt with. So it's like this ancestral genomic would probably be one of those things, at least taking up a significant objective portion of that we can, even if it's just 50% of the total magnitude, that's still something that we can use,
What's really interesting and fascinating to me is like now that we're in 2020, we're in the 21st century, we are, and like there's interracial, just everything, right? Like our even though I am also Middle Eastern, I have like some Turkish in me, I have some Persian in me, I have like and I'm like both my parents are from proper country, Iran. But even like if you look at, for instance, going back to the whole race correction thing, if someone has a white mother and a black father, are you going to do half a race correction? Are you going to base it on the mother or the father? And when we look at ancestral genomics, also, it's not even like we can say, okay, like your ancestry is from Nigeria, and like this is how we're gonna, like calculate that, or your ancestry is from like Kenya. Like I have a friend who, she's Somalian, but she was born and raised in Kenya. And like, it's very, it's still, even with that objective data, even with that genomic kind of component to it, it's still a gradient. We live in a modern world where our ancestries are just blended together. And so I think it's going to have to take a really smart scientist to be like, okay, this is how we make meaning from this. If you have this ancestral genetic allele or something, then have at it. This is your predicted outcome. And I don't pretend to know how to do that. Genomics is not really my background, but I think it's still, while I think it could be very impactful, I still think there are some challenges and some clear definitions that we would have to make, just because we are a melting pot. We have so much of everything inside of us. And so, yeah.
Because it kind of gets back to the idea of we need to be constantly revalidating things, right? It's not just we do something once and it's okay. We have to be constantly reassessing just to make sure that we're still including. You guys have any more questions? I feel like this was a really good discussion. I wasn't expecting much, but this was awesome. Thank you guys.
We're going into the last 5 minutes here, but I see this is being recorded, so I'm hoping we can get this uploaded to the Google Drive and maybe a link sent out to people or throw it on the Slack, because I think this was like wonderful start, like applause.
Yeah, I feel like I was saying that it definitely would be, I thought it would be running a lot longer, but I feel like that's what we want it to be, is kind of to allow this kind of discussion that we have time to just, talk about it, because that's what we're trying to do stuff. We're not just trying to learn. We are trying to learn. We're trying to do stuff with that information, and that has to take discussion.
For sure. I think something that I would love to see is potentially we have like a NeuroEquity YouTube account or something. We can upload these journal clubs. As long as everybody who's on the call agrees and all of that. But that might be something that we can look into and think about doing, just so we have, more people being able to access this and comment there, have the discussion, continue the discussion past this hour.
And if we decide to do that, we would pretty much open it for the entire medical community or anyone really to kind of explore it. And maybe we can get some insight that we didn't consider before, even through like that observation in the comments, or we could put like our information for them to contact us,
Yeah, I think that's
this
great
is
idea.
yeah. This is I like the way Deanna thinks. She thinks big, I think about logistics and how we're gonna get it done. She's like, yeah, let's just take it to the stars, bring it to the moon.
We have to have someone who's reasonable and realistic, Roxana, who keeps us going. And then there's me that comes in and sprinkles some like, okay, well, let's just do something completely off the wall.
Great, well, let's make it bigger.
No, I think that's absolutely the right mindset to have, and like thinking about like how to further our reach and our impact. And YouTube is such a great tool because it's free and everyone has access to it. And absolutely putting it up on a channel, again, with everyone's consent. And there's a way you can do that with Zoom, I believe.
I just love that Fiona has this sense of urgency at all times when it comes to these things. It's like, no, we need to do this. I'm going on Slack and I'm like, wow, Deanna is everywhere right
now. Yeah.
we got a dynamic individual right here.
But I have to tell you, Roxana is the only thing that kept us together these past like 4 or 5 months. Really, really, she's the backbone here. So, thank you for that.
Thank you to the both of you, because you guys together have made this thing something, and hopefully it grows into a lot more. And I'm excited to see what it does.
Same. I really am too.
Yeah, well,
oh, Roxanne, we can't hear you.
Always happens when my mic just decides to like die out on the mid-meeting. It's definitely not something I'm looking forward to for future meetings. But no, I was just saying that like Deanna makes it easy to be part of NeuroEquity. I love what we're doing here, and I really hope that we can expand our membership, our reach, make our names a little more well known in the community, and garner that support. So I'm thank you so much, Callie. This has been wildly amazing.
You helped a lot as well with me. Talking through this paper a couple of times. So thank you as well. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, Jenny, for joining, and Deanna, obviously.
And anybody that's watching this on YouTube now.
Yeah, anyone that's watching this on YouTube for taking an hour of your time.
Subscribe.
Check the links in the bio.
Like, subscribe, leave a comment.
If you want to listen to more of these videos, just subscribe to our channel.
We'll see you. Alrighty,
Aw.
guys. Thank you. The recording takes so when I did earlier, it took a while to like transpose or whatever the word is. So whenever I get it done, I'll send it over to whoever.
Okay. And then once we get it in a Google Drive, don't worry about the YouTube thing.
Okay.
I'll figure that out.
Perfect. All right.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, y'all.
See ya.
Thank you guys.